Morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Using AI to Understand Disaster Risks, New Tools, Shifting Frontiers, and Chronic Challenges. We've got a full room today, but I'll just do a brief intro to myself first. I'm a senior fellow at the Stimson Center. I'm an environmental anthropologist who spent more than 13 years working on issues related to disaster and climate risk management, environmental governance in the Himalayan region. I now lead a project on early warning systems for cascading disasters in Nepal, as well as some other work in the Himalaya. And that is what brings us to this webinar series. This one, a bit of orientation. This webinar is part of a broader series on disaster risk management that we've been organizing, a series of webinars that includes first two events organized in 2023 on the South Lonak Glacial Lake outburst flood in Sikkim, and in 2024 in August on the Tame Glaf. Those focused on multi-hazard risks and the systemic vulnerabilities that these particular events highlighted. We had another event about last month, a couple of weeks ago, that zoomed out a bit, which was focused on international best practices for designing early warning systems for the cryosphere, glacial hazards, and other types of hazards. And that highlighted case studies from Switzerland, China, and other parts of the Himalaya. This series overall is made possible by the support of the Government of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, and the McConnell Foundation. We're grateful for their interest and their support. We've had a great range of speakers for all these events, and we encourage you to check them out. But today's webinar takes us in a new direction, sort of building on the last one of zooming out and looking at international case studies and relevant technologies that can be applied to disaster risk, exploring how AI is being used to support the work of disaster risk management. We're really excited and grateful for the amazing lineup of speakers we have. And the goal of this panel is really to highlight an array of specific AI applications and capabilities, to be particular in our focus, drawing from projects ranging from the United States to the Himalaya to sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And this will help place these use cases within the broader landscape of AI as well, or of AI efforts within the various fields of DRM. We'll have a bit of technical detail as well, but we'll follow up on that in future events. This is meant to be the first of a series of webinars. The speakers for today's event have been carefully chosen as such. Their work helps us map out a frontier of novel, effective, and purposeful applications for AI. We envision this event as the first in the series, as I said, so we'll continue from this event, and this will sort of set the stage. Our goal is to cultivate a conversation about where we hear about the state of the art, but also bring a critical lens to prompt reflection on issues like the values and the commitments we bring to this work, to highlight the need for responsible and human-centered approaches, and to talk about how we wrangle with uncertainty, which is inescapable in working in the context of disaster, as many of us know. As the title of this event suggests, we are also particularly intent on learning how AI can help us reckon with chronic challenges in the DRM space, hazard-specific or more general, social challenges included, and we're interested in learning what other new challenges arise as this work evolves. In general, amid increasing enthusiasm for AI, greater socio-technical discernment is perhaps also needed to sort through the tangle of narratives and novelty, which can sometimes create a level of hype that can also be counterproductive at times and can eclipse other effective approaches. So we want to separate the signal from the noise. We believe everyone in this room has found the signal, has an incredible story to tell. As our colleagues will also say in this room, any AI application requires proper training, careful consideration of bias and governance issues, and a meaningful review of the risks involved. We'll dive more into this in our conversation later and in future events. But these realizations are, of course, not new. For just one example, there's a 2021 GFDRR report on responsible AI for disaster risk management. That conversation's been continued in other fora. There's a lot of other work on this. I encourage you to look at it. But as with any tech, using AI responsibly really requires striking a balance between tech-centered innovation and human-centered values. And given the intensity of disasters, increasing frequency, the levels of vulnerability that are inherent to working in the disaster context, as well as the increasing ubiquity and the power of AI, we feel the search for balance is ever more important. With that, I'll introduce my co-moderator, Rachel Law, who has helped conceptualize this event and this series. She's an engineer, and then we'll introduce our speakers in a second. She is an engineer and applied scientist specializing in geospatial intelligence, disaster risk, and applied AI. She has advised on infrastructure risk at USAID and consulted on disaster modeling for US state governments as well. But she and I met years ago in Kathmandu when she was working on the Kathmandu GeoLab, a really fantastic collaborative 30-member initiative she founded in 2019 when she was doing her PhD at Duke. Um, this focuses on the early warning for hazards and community engagement. We'll hear about that perhaps in another event. But she's been recently working at the Stimson Center as a consultant with some of the projects that we work on. And she's now become a member of our Loomis Innovation Council, a forum that informs Stimson's overall approach to navigating emerging global technology policy challenges. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel for a few more opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin. I want to start with something really simple. I think AI is a tool, right? It's not a silver bullet. It's not a replacement for the people and institutions who carry out the work, or the really hard work of disaster preparedness and response. Like any tool, its value depends on how it's used, who has access to it, and whether it's applied responsibly. Disaster environments are uniquely challenging as well. So they're resource scarce, high stakes, and often really chaotic and non-permissive at times. And information is incomplete, and it needs really urgent assessment, and decisions have to be made quickly and proactively. And so these are the exact kinds of situations where AI can be useful, whether it's helping us sift through vast amounts of geospatial data, identifying patterns in hazard forecasting, and getting critical information to decision makers faster for response purposes. AI has the potential to expand the toolkit we bring to the table. That said, with possibility comes a lot of responsibility. AI models are not perfect. We are often operating them in an environment where mistakes, biases, and over-reliance on technology can carry serious consequences. And they are shaped by the data they're trained on, the disaster context, and the data that is often noisy or incomplete. But with scarcity and challenge also comes a lot of creativity, which excites me a lot. So as scientists, practitioners, and policymakers, we need to work collaboratively and creatively to understand that the interface between AI and disaster response can exist, but it has to be treated with humility and care. And so our responsibility is not just to develop and deploy new tools, but to ask who benefits, who might be left out, and how do we build systems that are trustworthy, accessible, and actually useful to responders and affected communities. And so I'm so excited and so grateful to be working with Stimson on this webinar, to be addressing those questions, right? And so this webinar is about starting to have those conversations. I'm really excited about today's discussion, and to set the stage for the series ahead. And with that, I will pass it off to Austin.
So just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Our format for today is first is a series of lightning presentations, a short panel discussion afterwards of reflecting on a few common key questions, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A as soon as we can, hopefully just before the 60-minute mark. So we'll have almost 30 minutes for Q&A. It might be less because at the end we also have a little bit of a format for burning questions from the panelists to pose for future conversation, but about that. We'll also take a few technical questions after each of the first round of presentations. Again, burning technical questions. So if you have one of those, flag it, the questions, and we'll try to address at least one of them after every presentation. The questions can be entered into the chat box. It'll go into the overall, all the panelists will be able to see them. So please feel free to add your thoughts there. We'll take questions with the chat function starting now. With that, we'll just briefly introduce each panelist. The bios are on the website, but just to give a sense of who's in the room and why. To begin with, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Beth Tellman, a scholar and a practitioner who is currently both an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin and the chief scientist and co-founder at Floodbase, a company leading in this space that you'll hear a lot about today. She has led several different interdisciplinary research projects over the years and has been working to reduce flood exposure and vulnerability since at least 2009, before we met in early graduate school, a very long time ago. Today, she will share a bit about her journey, her reflections on AI in the flood space, and the latest cutting-edge work she's doing, both within academia and Floodbase. Rachel, you want to introduce some of the others?
Sure. I'm also really excited to introduce Dr. Pukar Amatia, a research scientist at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who also works with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Pukar is part of NASA's landslides teams, and as a landslide person myself, I'm super excited to see where he kind of works on developing automated detection algorithms to help identify when and where dangerous landslides might be happening. His work is a great example of how AI can really sharpen our ability to anticipate risk and respond more effectively to disasters. And on a personal note, we've had the chance to, see Pukar's work in action over the years. So it's a privilege to work with him. I'm also thrilled to introduce Dr. Dan Hammer. He's the co-founder of Legend, a venture-backed startup that is reimagining how we see the Earth, building AI infrastructure that makes satellite and environmental data accessible in ways that we've never had before. And he's also co-founded Ode, a design and technology agency creating tools for environmental action. Dan is a National Geographic Explorer and the recipient of both the Pritzker Environmental Genius Award and UC Berkeley's Mark Bingham Award for Excellence in Achievement. He holds a PhD and an MS from Berkeley. And his career has really been dedicated to understanding some of the most pressing environmental challenges. I'm really excited to hear his vision about how technology can help us reimagine our relationship and how we see the Earth, quite literally. So, yeah, I'm very excited to introduce Dan Hammer.
And lastly, we're pleased to welcome our first speaker, who will be kicking us off today, Kevin White, who serves as the Senior Director at Microsoft's AI for Good Lab. He's been in this role and worked with Microsoft for many years, developing innovative solutions that focus on humanitarian disaster response, resilience initiatives, and many other things. He has a wealth of knowledge about the evolution of AI applications for disaster risk management and public health more generally. And we look forward to hearing about some of the projects his lab is engaged with and others he has worked with and alongside, both in the Himalayas and elsewhere. And his insights into where further innovation might lead us next are also very welcome. With that, I will give the floor to you, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks, Austin. And it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today who's live and watching us. And welcome to those who can't join us live, but will review this in the future at their own leisure. But what an esteemed set of panelists. I feel honored to be here. I appreciate the invitation. And I'm really looking forward to just spending a few minutes here talking a little bit about how at the Microsoft AI for Good Lab, we are harnessing AI for good, and specifically on some of our disaster response and anticipatory action areas. Now, I think that many of us on this call will agree that we're facing big challenges, and these challenges aren't getting smaller. I always like to ground myself when I come to work every day, and why am I here, and why am I focused on this area? And just these stats are striking. Since 2022, 33 million people displaced. For the most vulnerable, 37 million children disrupted, kids that can't go to school, kids that see their parents working 2 or 3 jobs to recover from a disaster, and the most pressing, 1.2 million lives lost since 2000. So these are stats that we want to find ways and want to leverage tools, I think, as Rachel put it, to really kind of find ways to find new and novel solutions to address them. And there are many of problems like these out there, and we believe AI and technology can help. And we believe that it's a tool that when we apply the best practices that we have as technologists with the humanitarian sector and with those on the ground, it can really give us some pretty big step functions. So what I wanted to do today is really kind of focus on 3 lessons that we've learned, and then we'll take that into the panel discussion on really how AI can help us and how it can help us with understanding these risks and the impacts that we have. Now, we talk a lot about risks, but really one of the first learnings that I've had, I've been at Microsoft for over 20 years, the last 5 years in the philanthropy role here in the technology sector. But learning number 1 was really it's important for us to know where people live and how critical that is to saving lives. And it kind of seems obvious, but when we started on this journey and just having various conversations, we found that there are places in Afghanistan or in Somalia or Sudan where they didn't really know where people were. And so one of the key areas that we focused on was zooming in on Africa to start. And I want to give you an example of the illusion that we all think we know where people are. Many of us can open up Bing Maps or Google Maps and go and zoom in and see exactly where your car was a month ago on the street, but that's not the case. And just for example, here in Zinder and Niger, you can actually look at the growth trend of the population. And the last official census here was in 2012. And just to put that in perspective, here's the 2012 picture of Zinder. And now let's zoom into 2022. and look at that explosive growth. And let's keep in mind the concept of what if there's a disaster here? And how do the first responders in the humanitarian sector know where people are and how many people they need to respond to? And so what we do in our lab primarily focuses a catalytic converter to kind of really turbocharge organizations we work with, is working with the University of Washington Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation and with our partners at Planet Labs to really find a new way to determine detailed population maps. And we do that by taking daily satellite imagery, bringing that together quarterly, and then doing deep learning to understand building density over time. And then the University of Washington will actually apply a lot of their metrics to develop hyper resolution population metrics. And really what that does is it gives us this worldwide view of this temporal trends. Working with Planet, we're able to get detailed satellite imagery every couple days, and then we assimilate that into quarters, and we're able to see changes over time. This is something that we've now just launched a couple months ago. If you're interested in it, we'll share the links and you can come back and rewatch the webinar. We get a link on the bottom here to learn more. But this is an area that we'd love to see other people reaching out and finding innovative solutions to use this data. Once we have those detailed populations, we start getting into how do we align that with flood risk, with extreme heat, with insecurity, and really start being able to layer on where do we see the most vulnerable, and then how do we start preparing for the response. So the second learning I want to share, and we've already touched upon this with early warnings, is we really fundamentally believe that every person on Earth should be protected by early warning systems. This is something I work on very closely with the United Nations Early Warnings for All initiative. And just to give you an example of a project that we're doing right now, is taking those high resolution population maps and collaborating with the UN, who's built out these worldwide connectivity maps. And these are connectivity maps that really are focused on minimum 2G coverage. And by pulling these both together, for an example, in the Solomon Islands, we're able to start identifying at high resolution where are there unconnected populations. And in this case, these are folks that are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise, if there's a tsunami that comes through. And what we've done is throughout the Solomon Islands, we've kind of located about 120,000 people who are at extreme risk. Regardless of kind of going and finding more areas of risk, these are people that we know we need to make sure are connected now, and we deliver universal access for future risk. And then lastly, what I'll leave you with is the third learning is AI really fundamentally can be a tool to help us understand the risk. And really, there's a huge opportunity to better understand risk, actually by understanding what's happening today. So as Austin mentioned, I'll give kind of two examples here. One project that we've worked on, I think quite a few people know this in the Himalayas, is estimating the glacial lake trends. And using kind of segmentation models and historical imagery, we can go and we can find these glacial lakes at scale, and we can start understanding how they're changing. And you can kind of see the cause and effect here on the right in the little cartoon picture of what's happening because of climate change and those glacial lakes growing and then sometimes overflowing and going into horrible situations where they're taking down roads or destroying villages. And really about 12,000 people have been impacted worldwide and killed through these outbursts over the last decade. So it's a situation that once we applied AI, you can kind of see on the right, we can start mapping over time how these lakes are growing. And then those on the ground who can actually better understand the physics of the land and the risk that that's going to pose can start preparing or at least anticipate and notifying communities. So this is one example of how we're applying AI. And then the second one is understanding how we can find people who are growing in historical flood areas. There's a huge amount of work also in the forecasting of floods, which is hugely important, but there's also a clear picture of where we have seen flooding in the past is an area that's likely to see flood again in the future. And what we've done here is we've used SAR data to go and look over the globe over the past 10 years and identify basically where there's water, where there shouldn't be water. And so this is an example in Dolowato, Ethiopia. This is 2023 when they had an extreme flood event. And just kind of bring a lot of these pieces together. Here's the 2017 population using our high density population models. And then we can observe where we see the 2022 population growth over the last 5 years. Explosive growth in Africa, as many people know. Now, we then overlay where we've seen flooding in the last 10 years. And we see in these two areas where we have populations that are growing into the flood zone or populations that are growing near the flood zone. And those are areas of extreme risk. Similarly, we can look at an area in the northeast part of Ethiopia, Afambo, and here's where the population is. This is a largely farming community. And when we look at flooding, we see somewhat a good story when it comes to flooding. There's not a lot of people who are living where the floods are. That's probably because they've known this and they've chose where they live. But unfortunately, when we start overlaying where the crops are being grown, and this is the primary, livelihood of this area, we can start seeing that in these areas, they're historically prone to floods. And 11% of the cropland has been flooded, and over 7,000 people are actually near the floods that could be impacted. So this is another area how AI as a tool can help drive great insights, but still provide that capability to their first responders, to those on the ground and the humanitarian actors to really think through what are the policies and what are the programs we need to change or update or provide education opportunities for those on the ground. Now, the power is we have to do this at scale. I'm really excited to hear from Dan and Beth on their work, because I think they're doing a bunch of work at scale too on Earth observations and Praia. So with that, I'm going to leave everybody with some information. Here's our historical flood open source data set and the model. We'll have this also available for people to look at if they want to. I'd asked to leave everybody with one question as we go to the panel. And really what I've learned quite a bit is there's still a lot of value to be unlocked and a lot of creativity to be had by using the data that we have today. There's been a lot of, we can all get caught up as AI scientists, and we need more data and we need more satellite images and we need more, but there is a lot today. And so while we look towards the future, I'm really curious and I'm really excited to learn more about what we can do with what we have today. So with that, over to you, Austin and Rachel.
Well, thank you, Kevin. With that, we'll pivot back over to our next speaker. We've got a couple questions rolling in the chat, but I think they're sort of general questions for the room. We are a little bit short on time with the presentation, so we'd like to. Okay, we've got one quick one, Kevin. Where does the data for this analysis come from? Does the government own the data for their region, or is Microsoft storing this information? That's a quick burning tech question. Maybe you can comment on briefly.
Yeah, a couple things. So all the work that we do in the lab is open source, and we do it with partners. So for example, the flood data, well, because that came actually from just STAR data that came in and it's publicly information. All of that is public. It's out there. Anyone can pick it up and use it. For the precision population data, that comes, the fundamental data that it starts with is with planet imagery. We provide building density, which goes into a model that the University of Washington is building, which is the population model, and the University of Washington will host and share that as a digital public good for non-commercial activity.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And on a quick note, I hope we get a chance to talk about some of the post-earthquake damage assessment work you've done using that type of process in Myanmar after the recent earthquake later in the discussion. With that, we can turn it over to Beth. And thank you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Austin. And great transition and setup from Kevin talking about flood mapping, because that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about, but some cool applications of it. And I'm going to get a little more technical and methodological here. So let's go. I'm going to show you what I've been up to in this space. I'm Beth Tellman, and I get to play this really cool role where I'm both at a university most of the time, but some of the time, at least one day a week, sometimes more, I'm at this company I started called Floodbase, and we apply AI for flood mapping in a commercial context, mostly for insurance. So I'll talk about some of those applications too. I got into flood mapping because I was a disaster relief responder in El Salvador and lived there for 4 years. And we didn't really have any data or information to do our work. And so I went back to grad school to learn how to do flood mapping and got really involved in machine learning and satellite observation and have been doing that for the past decade. I've worked also a lot on deforestation and urbanization, but I'm just going to talk about the work that I've been doing in flooding today. Austin asked me to start off with like some kind of landscape analysis of tools in flood forecasting, response, and risk. And there are many more than I have listed on this sort of slide I made, but this is what comes to mind. And I wanted to break it up sort of into 4 categories. We could think about, how often has it flooded here? I should now add Microsoft AI for Good to this map, looking at images of the past or FEMA maps that try to model that. Where is it flooding right now? I do a lot of this kind of work, and we see a lot of AI in trying to make better predictions of did it flood today or did it flood last week, both with private companies and with public tools. And then, is it going to flood tomorrow? This is so much harder of a problem. And I think it's not kind of, in my opinion, using some of these tools, not quite sort of finance or insurance ready and still pretty uncertain because it's forecasting. But we're seeing a lot of exciting things that AI is doing in the flood forecasting space. And then, is it going to flood in the next 50 years? I'm really excited about kind of new companies entering this space, especially the ones like 7 Analytics who are taking insurance claims data to really look at damage trends in their AI models, or companies like Fathom who are using climate models directly, I think in really responsible ways. So that's my landscape analysis for you, Austin, and happy to take more questions about sort of my hot take on this. And I've just circled the ones that are pretty heavily using AI in their approaches, which also happen to be the ones that I think are more accurate and kind of finance ready. So that's my hot take. What I've been doing in my lab at the university is definitely using AI with satellite imagery, but we merge that data with social science to try to make the world a better place and co-design tools with people to do that. And the reason we love to use satellite data, and I love to use satellite data, is because flood models, which has been the tool that's typically been used to estimate flood risk, tell you the probability of where a flood might happen, but satellites take an image of what actually happened. And it's become pretty obvious, I would say, in remote sensing that using AI is going to allow you to squeeze the most information you can out of every image. And to me, that's sort of a given now and been proven a lot in science. So I won't debate that, but I'll tell you some of the interesting things that you can do with those methods. This is a slide for the folks that maybe know what AI is, but don't know anything about kind of architectures. The kind of architectures that I've been using a lot, both in the Social Pixel Lab and at Floodbase, are convolutional neural networks. These became really popular, for example, in image recognition technology. And the way I like to explain this is that you're upscaling kind of features of high variance. So like a line and a circle, and then constructing that into a nose or an eye, and then constructing that up into a whole face. And all of that is happening by using convolutions and math and image pixels. And that connectivity and scaling helps preserve spatial patterns that does a really great job of doing things like extracting water out of satellite images and learning these sort of meta patterns of like, how does water look different in a desert versus an agricultural field? And to build these types of models, you need a lot of training data. My lab has released and produced a lot of that. Sun 1 Floods 11 is our older data set, but we recently released Flood Planet, which is our newer data set on planet imagery. Please use it for your benchmarking if you're in this space. The last thing I want to say about architectures is that convolutional neural nets are still really good. UNets are the very popular architecture in remote sensing, and it's still great. Like I like to say for the Gen Z population, they still slap. You can get meaningful improvements with fancier architectures. I think especially long short-term memory networks that add temporal dimensions, and maybe transformers, especially if you're using other kind of embeddings from foundation models, especially where I'm seeing gains on commercial imagery. I'll say a word about that in a minute. But I kind of think the architecture that's been winning for the past 5 to 10 years is still pretty great. So that's my takeaway there. Once I make satellite-based flood maps, one of the things that we're doing in my lab is we're trying to find where there's kind of hidden risk in the system. So kind of Kevin talked about this earlier. Where are we building in the floodplain? And one thing that I've been looking at with a new NSF grant that's sort of been taken away and put back recently was, where are FEMA maps being changed? You can essentially, if you don't want to be in the FEMA floodplain and have to pay insurance, you could hire an engineering company, submit a letter of map revision, and get out of the FEMA floodplain. Unfortunately, most of those are approved, and sometimes there's still risk in the system when those approvals are made. Camp Mystic, very unfortunately, kind of famously, as reported in the New York Times, submitted one of these letters of map revision and definitely had cabins that flooded, unfortunately, in the floodway, as we saw in the last month. And so I'm building a really large data set across the US to look at all these FEMA changes and say, where do we have more Camp Mystic-like risk? And how can satellite data show us where that is? And maybe we can rethink this policy of just approving all these map changes that engineering firms are submitting. Another application of AI and satellite imagery that I've been working on is for flood justice. And we call this project Flujos, Flood Justice Utilizing Satellite Observation. Lucas Belluri, my PhD student, has been leading it with Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid in the Rio Grande Valley. And what we've been doing is constructing a flood map history co-designed with 5 community-based organizations. It was actually most recently used just this past March for long-term recovery aid, advocacy with county commissioners. Orgs are using it for grant writing. But what's important about this tool is not that it's just satellite-based flood maps, but we actually used human-in-the-loop approaches to take residents' flood experiences and make the flood maps better and train to what they've lived through. So we took our AI flood maps, printed them off, ran workshops with residents, and had them draw on the maps and say, where are our maps right and wrong? So you can kind of see in purple here. They're like, you missed this flooding that happens through this section of our community. Then we retrained our algorithm to help reflect that. So before we had residents' data in orange, here's where we predicted water on this map. Now with residents' data, we've got a new algorithm trained here in blue, and we can see these really large differences kind of in areas that I've circled in neighborhoods that flooded, where we're seeing about 10% accuracy gains. And it's not just about like the algorithm's better, because of course you want the algorithm to be better. It's also just about the process of trust, of working with people on the ground who are going to use this data, having them understand it and get to be a part of it, like actually a part of the algorithm. I find that really important for impact. I want to say one more word about foundation models, and this will be sort of my last technical point. We've been experimenting with them in my lab. My postdoc, Sarab Kaushik, has been leading this work. We have a paper right now in review. Our main takeaway is that foundation models help, but they really only make a big difference if you just have a few labels. If you have hundreds of labels to train your flood map algorithm for remote sensing, we're really not seeing that big of a difference in accuracy. We're measuring this with an F1 or an MIOU score from foundation models. These are these 3 at the top, Privy, Clay, and DOFA that we've tested, to kind of other transformer or UNet models that did not use a foundation model. Unless you only have 2 or 3 labels, then we're seeing really big differences. So that's kind of my takeaway. There's a big debate happening right now in remote sensing. I love Christopher Wren's kind of blog posts on this, geospatial foundational disappointments, and he has a really interesting hot take on Google's new Alpha Earth model I would encourage you to check out. And my main takeaway here, although as a scientist, I'm super interested in, are foundation models really going to make a difference? You know, I think for local disaster response and impact, I would really focus just on better data and more labels, and don't get too distracted by fancy AI architectures. This kind of goes to the first point that I made of like, UNets still slap. the old architectures are still pretty good. And I think your time is better spent, honestly, collecting people's experiences of where it flooded and training an older machine learning architecture on that experience still. I'll say a word about commercial applications of some of these AI-based flood maps with my company, Floodbase. Our maps were actually on the cover of the New York Times, showing kind of the evolution hour by hour of the flooding at Camp Mystic in Texas. And we can do this because we fuse not just satellite data, but we also include hydrologic models and other ground inputs, which we have found critical to making a continuous flood map hour by hour. You just never get enough satellite observations to get a complete and amazing flood map at that spatial and temporal resolution. And so we actually train stream flow, rain gauges, the US National Water Model on satellite-based flood maps so that we can make something that looks like a satellite-based flood map every hour anywhere in the US, and it goes back 40 years. And that historical going back 40 years component is really critical to pricing insurance. And so it's not just about, can I make the best flood map today, but can I make a flood map that's consistent over many decades? You've got to be able to do that to price a financial instrument. While we do provide an event response tool for hourly flood mapping anywhere across the US, we've worked with FEMA and Hurricane Helene, really helping them prioritize their significant needs assistance because we can do this instantly over many large areas. A lot of traditional high accuracy flood models, it's really hard to do over like 9 states at once. You tend to do it in kind of in smaller areas. And so this approach is really great for that large scale analysis. But I think the real value of what Floodbase does is not just the answering the did it flood today question, but combining flood history with the did it flood today question for an insurance instrument. So the city of Fremont in California purchased a parametric insurance policy where they actually get paid out if flooding happens above a critical threshold that Floodbase determined, and they pay this premium to Amwins and Swiss Re that brokers and backs the policy. And then our data is used to determine if they should get a payout or not. And we do this again by creating this history of flooding and seeing if it flooded today. And that helps underwrite and settle a parametric policy. So that was the last application I wanted to share. So I'll stop there for time. Here's kind of takeaways that I've already talked about. The last thing I do want to mention, just on a note on limitations. So while I have seen huge gains of AI for flood mapping in my direct space, and also in the future risk and forecasting space, it is always going to be limited to the observation density and quality that you have. So if you have a lot of rain flow and stream gauges, your model is going to be great. And if you don't, it probably won't. And I just still think we haven't solved for that fundamental problem in flooding. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to start with a few Q&As just for you, Dr. Tallman. The first one being, for Monica's question, when they tried to do climate risk assessment for low and middle income countries, there was a huge data gap. So this is kind of addressing what you were just talking about. Have you or do you know any org that's been able to analyze and predict stormwater flooding for cities in low and middle income countries?
Nothing that comes immediately to mind. First, what's so hard about stormwater flooding is you have to know something about the drainage network of that location or try to back it out. You could try to do that potentially with satellite imagery, but I can't think of any like models or companies that are doing this like off the top of my head. Because most of the models that exist for low and middle income countries are pretty coarse resolution, and I think it'd be pretty tough to make stormwater assessments from the data that I know about offhand. But feel free if other folks know of things in the chat.
Awesome. And then kind of to piggyback onto that, in areas where data is super scarce, how are physics-based models being used for flood mapping, and what role does AI or hybrid modeling play in bridging those data gaps? And that's from Rahal.
Yeah, huge role. I mean, I would say at flood base, for a long time, we just used satellite data to map water, and we had to start integrating in physics-based models in order to plug gaps. So really critical. We're building out now to have sort of that same approach globally, probably mostly using ECMWF's model. So they have a kind of global flood model that's pretty coarse. The data's not awesome, but if you use AI and a ton of satellite observations, we think we can probably make it pretty awesome. So yeah, I think physics models are hugely important. We do not have the spatial and temporal density of observations to just rely on those to make good models. So we cannot live without them, I would say, at this stage.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And with that, we will pivot to Pukar. Matya, Dr. Matya, we're ready for you.
Yeah, so thanks, Rachel. Good morning. My name is Pukar Amatya. Today, I'm going to talk about landslide detection using machine learning, which is my research focus. I'm going to talk about some of the models we have developed, some of the evolution in the field, and also briefly going to touch base on landslide forecasting, which is led by other members of my team. So I'm part of the landslide research team at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, where we map and model landslides at different scales. At local scale, we develop landslide detection algorithms. At regional scale, we develop landslide hazard models. And at global scale, our landslide hazard assessment for situational awareness LASA model provide near real-time estimates of landslide hazards. So if anyone is interested more in our work, I encourage you to visit landslide.nasa.gov. So one of the first most information needed for formulating effective landslide hazard and risk management strategies are record of past landslides. Conventionally, these are generated manually. To make the process a little bit easier, we developed the semi-automatic landslide detection system we call SALAD. So it basically combines various Python packages and use object-based image analysis and machine learning to map landslides. So in object-based image analysis, instead of working with single pixel for a spatial process like landslides, so we group similar pixels or homogeneous pixels into objects using image segmentation algorithms. Then landslide diagnostic features such as NDVI, slope, brightness, texture, etc. of these objects are used to map landslides, right? Manual inventory of landslides are used to train a random forest model. Then the objects are like classified into landslide or non-landslide class. At the final steps, objects belonging to landslide class are dissolved to form a landslide inventory. So for validation, we compare the detected landslides with manually mapped landslides and use two accuracy matrices, recall and precision. So recall basically gives you an idea of like what percentage of manually mapped landslides were detected, and precision gives you an idea of like out of all the detection, what percentage were actual landslides, right? So based on these matrices, you can see like 30% of the manually mapped landslides were missed in the detection, and also there were about 20% false positive, right? So this highlights that even with machine learning system, we can only push accuracy up to a certain level, right? Getting it to the final QA/QC, high quality inventory does require some manual corrections. However, in scenarios such as situational awareness, rapid response, or coarse scale landslide modeling, then the time gained utilizing SALAD to create these inventories are of prime importance. Like for example, a 25 kilometer and by 25 kilometer satellite tiles, manual mapping of landslides took about 26 hours. But using SALAD, adding in time to generate training data, this process was completed within 40 minutes. So around 2017, like I guess deep learning based landslide mapping systems started gaining popularity. And in the screen, you see like one of the most famous CNN based architecture unit. The main advantage of using a deep learning system is it's easy to set up a little bit. You know, you have Python packages which allow you to set up a model using a single line of code. And then once you have a trained model, then the process of prediction becomes very quick, you know, matter of minutes. The disadvantage compared to something like SALAD will be that it requires a large amount of training data, and also training takes a considerable amount of time. So for one of our project with a goal of generating yearly inventory of landslides in Nepal, like we're testing out various deep learning models, presented our results based on the unit architecture, trained with manually mapped landslides from the region following the 2015 Gorkha earthquake. Evaluation was done purposefully over a large area. To be specific, like we evaluated using for a single sentinel tile, which is 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers. The accuracy metrics here highlights that even with localized training, it is very difficult to accurately map landslides over large area, specifically for a heterogeneous landscape like that we have in Nepal. So recently, like foundation models have been gaining popularity. Foundation models are these large deep learning neural networks self-trained on unlabeled data. So the idea is like rather than starting from scratch, one can use a foundation model as a starting point to develop application more quickly and cost effectively. Generally, a small amount of task representative data set is used to train the foundation model to adapt it for a specific task, right? So on the screen, you see one of such foundation model developed by IBM and NASA called Prithvi 2.0. It's trained on millions of harmonized Landsat Sentinel-2 data at 30-meter resolution. As a Landsat mapping test, like the foundation model was fine-tuned using Land4Sense reference data set, which is based out of Sentinel-2. So the results were comparable to CNN and other architecture, even with like significantly less training data. This opens up some new avenue to utilize foundation model for specific Landsat mapping scenario, for example, rapid responses, where sometimes we need to do site-specific training and we have only like small training data available. So we also use machine learning for landslide forecasting. Forecasting is the process of predicting landslide hazard days in advance. So on the screen, you see one of our projects where we're using architecture of LASA 2.0 developed by us for forecasting landslide in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So information on ground conditions, antecedent and forecasted precipitation leading up to the past recorded landslides are fed into an XGBoost model to predict a landslide hazard for the future, right? So here in the screen, you see Landsat hazard predicted for June 29, 2023, 1 day ahead. And here you see the landslides that were actually induced in June 29th reported in the disaster portal. So the match is quite good. So to end, like I would just like to reiterate some challenges, associated with using deep learning models for detection. It is in need of diverse training data set, right? Landslides differ in shape and size, and appearance might be different in a satellite image depending upon geology of an area. So we need samples from all around the world. Although community reference data sets exist, we need to grow it by addition of samples from different geological and land cover settings. And with rapid advancements such as foundation model and stuff, like it necessitates a strong collaboration between computer scientists and applied scientists to achieve ideal and best model setup for Landsat mapping. An encoder is there, but really the choice of decoder, loss function, learning rate guides accuracy. So this collaboration might also ensure that the models are not only technically robust, but also relevant, effective, and useful in rapid response scenario. For forecasting, like we need landslide information with date of when it happened. Usually, like we get it from media reports, but finding exact location is quite challenging, which might introduce some positional inaccuracy in the training data. So we should be very careful of that. And also, generally, like precipitation data, be it forecast or like some GPM, something comes in coarse resolution. So this might introduce some errors, specifically in relation to orographic precipitation, which generally happens in mountainous areas, and landslide do tend to happen more over those kind of scenarios, right? So looking at the ongoing advancement and challenges, an open question, I was asked to post an open question, right? So that might be like, is replacing humans using AI for decision making for a complex geological process for Landsat possible, or it will remain an aiding tool? So that's the open question that I want to post here. So thank you. And if you have any questions, please you can contact me anytime using the email listed in the slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Pukar. That was excellent. I think we've got a couple of questions that came into the chat for you. We're just going to do one now so we can get to the panel. Rachel, you have one picked out that you want to share? As our fellow landslide wonk here, related.
Sure. I think as a fellow fellow landslide wonk, as Austin said, right? There's a lot of different kind of variables that go into landslide forecasting, and so I think a really interesting one here is posed by Anthony Scriffignano, which is, if possible, could you address some of the controls unprecedented events or situations where man-made and unpredictable behaviors cause disaster in the landslide space?
Yeah, so unfortunately, forecasting is not my expertise, right? I'm just putting aside, but I guess like the way the model is trained right now, like is based on rainfall triggered landslides, right? We are not looking at like human activities or landslides that are uh, induced due to construction activities or something like that. So our model intrinsically is only geared towards looking at rainfall induced landslides. So I think right now, like we don't have that ability to look at like or constrain human activities on the forecasting side of things.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, lots of chronic questions in the Himalaya too about those unforeseen human activities. So with that, we'll pivot over to our final speaker, Dan Hammer, who we've already introduced, who has a phenomenal amount of things to say. Excited to see what he shares with us today. Thank you, Dan.
Well, I withhold that judgment because I had a presentation planned, but the benefit of going last, or maybe the risk of going last, is to be able to respond and to drink a lot of coffee in the interim. So going rogue here. I'm going to start with where sort of I'm going to focus more on sort of the product associated with, or new product that's available using large scale Earth observation models rather than the model architectures themselves. And starting from just like from my own history, because we've started to see history start to repeat itself. So I got my start building Global Forest Watch early on. This was in the last big platform shift around 2008 when cloud came on the scene. And all of a sudden, like small scale or researchers, or research assistants as the case may be, could start to run these global models to assess changes on the Earth's surface and create measurements that were available everywhere, but frankly useful nowhere. The precision at every pixel was wrong. And it still is wrong for a lot of these global models out there, especially as you start to bucket in these broad classifications or concepts. Even deforestation means something totally different in different parts of the world right now. So when you have a global deforestation model, it means something different and misses local subtleties. But what was really cool about this time period is that everywhere you looked when we started to work on the cloud, you could see improvements of 10 times bigger or 10 times faster, and then sometimes 10 times better. So better, faster, cheaper, just by virtue of using clusters of compute that weren't available to, I mean, at the time, a research assistant in an economic think tank. You could start to build these models that at least were in the conversation with large scale academic models. I was going back through the code here and looked, and it's been really long time. And a lot has happened in the interim since we started to build out Global Forest Watch, including the advent of transformer models. The T of GPT, of ChatGPT. And we didn't invent these things. In fact, some really smart people invented this new architectures. And for that, people have won 4 Nobel Prizes and a Turing Award. This is a big deal, and it's a big shift. And you can start to feel that same sense of like, everywhere you look, there's some major improvement. Things are getting 10 times faster, 10 times bigger, or 100 times faster, or thousands of times faster in order to collect and analyze information. I will say this though, I haven't seen any of these large models get better than than the architectures of 5 years ago. But I really liked what Dr. Tellman said, which was that the idea of working with people on the ground who don't necessarily code in order to build trust in the data. And that's this big shift that seems to be happening. It's not getting better algorithms. We won't beat UNets right now especially for predictions. But you can develop an interface based off of these new models that involve many more people in the creation of data, which is really compelling. And we've seen that for ChatGPT. I mean, like 5 years ago, if you were a digital marketer, you didn't use natural language processing, but now every single person uses large language models or these language AI in order to help with, generating a LinkedIn post or an email to your wife. Don't do that, actually. I've been told not to do that often. So about 2.5 years ago, alongside one of my co-founders, Bruno, who had built the Microsoft's planetary computer, we started to train a model out in the open. It's the P and the T of GPT, but trained on satellite imagery rather than on text. And we started to see some ways in which it was really, really useful. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And this one started to be useful, especially for the identification of changes in local infrastructure at very high precision that people could see and trust. This model is totally open source and nonprofit, and it has its flaws. It's not very good. It should be very good later. The premise of Clay now is to aggregate donated compute from like Amazon Web Services, for example, in order to train these models in a larger and larger way out in the open. Basically the idea here is that there are still economies of scale of these models for this modality, for Earth observation. That is, right now, until we know more, bigger is better. It's better to spend $1 million on one model than 100,000 on 10 because of those scale economies. And so that's the premise of doing this out in the open, alongside many of these other models that are coming out from IBM, Google, NVIDIA. It's very NASA is one of the better ones right now. But what we had discovered is that the training of these models is necessary but not sufficient to effectuate the type of change that we would want to see in the world. And by that, it's the fluency with the way in which the Earth is changing. There's a lot of distance between the models, which at the end of the day is just a list of model weights. It's a list of numbers, and end-use application, the way in which people use those numbers in order to find what they're looking for faster, and even 10,000 times faster. And so for that, we had started to develop, we have a startup now called Legend, which is the infrastructure that sits between any of these models, not just Clay, and those end-use applications. So for example, identifying the construction of levees in Louisiana, for example, and just having the most up-to-date inputs to potentially like flood models, for example. Not necessarily doing the measurement or prediction, but all of that sort of information gathering in order to help train those models right now. Again, this doesn't make anything better along the better, faster, cheaper as far as we're concerned, but it makes it so much faster and cheaper. So this is very similar. We sort of see this new technology not so much as building a global data set of where, for example, landslides or flooding are. We consider this a lot more like Copilot. And Copilot is one of these tools that the coders are using right now in order to help them generate their own code or write their code. It's supposed to enhance human activity. If you did sort of an academic benchmark of Copilot right now, it's terrible relative to like experienced human engineers. But that still doesn't mean that Sundar, the CEO of Google, had just cited that 25% of Google's code is now generated by AI. So even though it's bad, it's incredibly useful. So the question is like if you had that type of assistance as a practitioner on the ground in order to find what you're looking for, what would you use it for, and how would you use it? Well, one sort of like demo here of how you might use it is here, which is this is a particular interface operating on the outputs of one of these large Earth observation models, an LEOM rather than an LLM. And there's lots of different ways to use these models. You can use them to generate content like you do in like ChatGPT, or you can use them for fine tuning, or in this particular case, information retrieval, which seems relevant for this particular panel. So suppose that I was interested in identifying like where there were like east-west oriented solar panels in California. Instead of handcrafting a custom convolutional neural net on satellite imagery, which takes a little time, the idea is like, all right, I know what I'm looking for. Show me how do I, hold on. Zoom is blocking me. Ay, ay, ay. All right, hold on a sec. All right, there we go. Suppose that I was interested in finding these east-west oriented solar panels. This is basically a prompt now. I say, hey, find me everything else like this. And because most of the compute on these pre-trained unsupervised models was done like, before, all across the world, across all these clusters, I can now interact with those outputs in order to find east-west oriented solar panels. But it's just as easy because it's unsupervised to change that query, right? And instead of retraining, but with point and click, sort of no code, say I'm interested in north-south oriented solar panels and edit it very, very quickly. That prompt. So it's this fluency with being able to ask those small triangulating questions that actually we think are really useful for practitioners. Like I don't go like to Google and say like, tell me where to go to coffee this morning. I find that Starbucks, I mean, a local custom coffee shop that doesn't hurt the world, right? But by like triangulating lots of different smaller queries, like what's open right now, what's close to the place I'm going to next. It's this triangulation of these small queries, which before each one costs so much money. There's so much friction in order to interact with it. Another way in which this is cool is we built this notional product for the former fire marshal in California who doesn't want another hazard map of where fire might be, but in fact, like where do you go right now to allocate resources? So for example, show me where there are intersecting fire roads with a staging ground in California. You say, I know where a couple of them are, show me where the rest of them are. But because now we're in this new transformer space, we can start to interact with it in language as well, which is not better, it's just more fluid as a way in which you would interact with it through space and through time. So those fire roads that are overgrown within, and over the last 2 years, within 100 feet of power lines, for example. So that level of fluency of that iterative filtering. And in new AI speak, it's called elicitation, which is just iterative information gathering. And we've seen how powerful that is for in the language space. And the question is how powerful is it in the Earth observation space? And frankly, no one knows right now. Like we're starting to see it valuable for various small sort of anecdotal evidence, but we don't know what this looks like systemically right now. The last thing I'll say is like the way in which this shows up in the world. This was something that we actually worked on a while ago with the earlier version of this technology, which was to identify illegal gold mines in the Amazon or illegal mining activity in the Amazon. And what really sort of like shifted our opinion of what this sort of technology could enable that couldn't happen before is that these mines were found by, we were called Earthrise at the time, by ninth grade students, at the urging of an astronaut to say, hey, please help us find this type of phenomenon on the Earth's surface. And the idea that a group of ninth graders equipped with just a little bit more fluency around data could find something that would hit Reuters or in another story, the front page of the New York Times in order just to find these things. And it was done by either journalists or ninth graders, or basically the only equivalent between those two is that they're not coding here, was really powerful. And so what we're working on now is the infrastructure in order to deliver these new models to those that aren't going to code up their own neural net. Okay, I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. So one of the questions that we have here in the chat is there a shift from unsupervised models with clusters to deep learning neural networks in what you've seen?
Is that for the whole panel?
I think that's for you.
Oh, well, so the way in which we're doing this now is we're using these like unsupervised models in order to collect the inputs to more supervised models that can be run on the fly and in embedding space. So it can be run like basically within a chat prompt. You can say like, here's a couple of examples of what I'm looking for. Can you help me find more of them? And the idea of being able to run these more supervised models in embedding space, which is way, way faster than on satellite imagery, means that this sort of like iteration or like these cycles of supervised and then unsupervised, supervised and unsupervised happens in chat time or test time rather than doing like very, very large runs. We don't know if that's better or not. Sort of the benchmarks right now are mainly academic benchmarks rather than evals. A benchmark in product is an eval. And we don't have evals for the way in which you would use satellite imagery for these types of data set creation. And that's one of the value propositions of Legend, is putting this into practice to be able to understand if you're getting better or not when you have a human in the loop and gathering.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you, Dan. That type of adaptive learning is exactly the type of application we want to highlight here. We're running a little bit behind, but not too much. We want to just ask one or two questions to the panel that we have. We have a few formulated. We're only going to choose two of them for now since we're a little short. And then we'll open up for questions. So if you have any others, please get them ready. But the first thing, we're going to combine two questions here. I think each of you have talked a little bit about how you define success, either in a technical sense or a social sense, or ideally both. I think you've all done a great job of that. You've also talked a little bit about the positionality of your organization and the interdisciplinarity required for thinking with communities and thinking with data. But a quick question I'm really keen on is what sort of ethical issues have you encountered? What kind of ambiguities might arise when you're doing this work? What ethical commitments are really important to you? If responsibility or responsible AI is a goal, what are your sort of key thoughts or your core values that shape your approach? And that's a question to each of you. If anyone who wants to go first.
I mean, I'm happy to start. I think the first and foremost for me is local partners are important. And it's really difficult. I think, Dan just hit on this, and I think everyone's mentioned it in one way or another, which is inventing things in the lab is very different than inventing things in the real world. When you invent things in the lab, you are going to have bias, you're going to have blind spots, you're going to have uneven performance, and it's those things we all hear about and we're trained to think about, but then you still goof on the first time or second time and you realize, okay, yeah, there is that is white hot, don't touch that. I also think so every project that we work on in the lab, we don't do a project unless we have a partner involved. Like, we're not here to, and everything we do is open source anyways. We're part of the philanthropy part of Microsoft. So our whole goal is let's find a local partner on the ground, understand their subject matter expertise, and understand how to help them and be a catalytic event, and then back away. So I think that's one thing that I think is kind of transformable, and different organizations can take that in different ways. And then the last thing I would say is building a diverse team is important. If you have 2 or 3 people, I do think that's understated. To get people, our team we're on 4 continents. We've got 20 different languages, totally different cultures. And the amount of times where we just get in a conference room or on a Zoom call, or for us, a Teams call, and we actually just talk through a problem, and I learn things every day. So I do think that's really important. And trust is the number one priority at the end of the day. As soon as you lose trust in the work that you're doing, it evaporates and doesn't come back. So just some of my thoughts, but curious to hear what the other panelists think.
Yeah, I can go next. For me, based on my work, right, the biasness of training data presents the main ethical issue, because I work with landslides, right? Model learn from data that you are trained on. So if data contains biases like only representing majority class for a specific geographic region, land cover, or environmental condition, the model might perform poorly or unfairly in underrepresented areas of scenario, right? For example, for specific to landslides, the reference data set that are out there will work very nicely in the forested region where it's very easy to distinct landslides from non-landslides, right? When we have to go towards higher Himalaya region or urban region, it might fail, which might lead to ultimate improportionate distribution of relief aid and something like that. So for forecasting landslides, landslides are generally reported near settlements where people have seen a landslide, right? But these kind of landslides might be happening in rural area as well. So these are kind of biases that we have to deal with specifically regarding the training data set. And the way to get around this is like have an open dialogue with stakeholders and understand like under what kind of scenarios like they are trying to apply our models. And we also get the sense of like what is needed where, right? Open communication about limitations and potential biases will help as well. When we get a sense of like what the scenario is, we can decide on like what model to use. It doesn't have to be state of the art. I think we have heard a lot of conversation here about like simple like unit architecture slaps. So I think I totally agree with that thought. So in the meantime, like when there are no disasters, we're not doing responses, we can prioritize like gathering diverse and representative data set worldwide and add to the existing data set, as well as learning from each mapping event and using that result as a feedback in a continuous loop to improve the model. So I guess that's how I would deal with the biases right now. Yeah.
I'm going to go super academic because I sort of wrote a paper about this topic. This is like the sad academic answer to your super great question, Austin. But we did with Mia Bennett at the University of Washington and some other remote sensing folks wrote this paper. She's sort of been working in this field that she calls critical remote sensing to just like think deeper about, I mean, it's a more satellite image specific than AI specific, but like, what does satellite data not tell you? And what does that responsibly mean for how you use that data with human beings who could actually cause harm in the world by doing so? My kind of biggest ethical story that I like to tell is when we were working in South Sudan with the World Bank, like making flood maps publicly available, they were like, you know what? Let's not do that because, militias in South Sudan could use that to figure out when is the riverbed dry and then go across the river and burn a village. And had we not been in conversation with people in the Red Cross on the ground in that context, we would have naively thought transparency for data is just good, but it's might not be. And unless you're actually talking to people, you're not going to uncover those, I think, really big ethical pitfalls. And so I think it's like a recommendation as old as time, but like nobody knows their landscape better than the people who live in them. And if you're disconnected from that, you could actually cause harm in the world. And I think we've got to be a lot more responsible about that. I am way more concerned about that than I am about sort of specific bias, I would say, in AI models. So I'll leave it there. We call it the exposure, empower, and engage framework.
Dan, do you want to jump in on this one?
No, I think
Okay.
everything I would say is redundant.
All right. Rachel, you want to ask the last question we have, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Sure. Awesome. Another kind of segue is looking at validation, right? So I think it's been iterated multiple times throughout the panel, right? Disasters are typically data scarce. There's few ground truth events, sometimes scaling issues. And so, and I think it's also been kind of pointed out, right, that a lot of these models need human input, or at least be designed in a way like that is ethical, or it strives for ethical standards. And so what kind of challenges do you face in validating models, whether it's looking at data scarcity, sparsity, few ground truth events, shifting data sets? And can you give us an example of an approach you use? And another way to think about it is, do you have different approaches to supervision, and how do you incorporate kind of expert judgment in that through the validation process?
Okay, I can go with everybody's quiet. So yeah, I guess like for validating like the primary things that we face in landslide scenarios in general is in a disaster scenario, you don't have controls on like what type of satellite imagery you get, right? It might be moderate resolution, high resolution. Generally, all the training data sets that we have are like specifically based on one satellite. So I think it's very difficult for us to use that and then try to predict on whatever satellite imageries that we have, right? So the solution might be to increase representation from various satellites in a training data set. And also like this shifting data set disaster scenario, which I've already touched base upon, is like model is trained under one under one land cover classes, and then we are trying to predict it over other areas. It doesn't work. So I guess the solution to that, like on how I look at it, is like if it doesn't work, then we start from scratch, right? So we can use models like Salad or something which can do training in quick amount of time. Or the strategy might be do like transfer learning or fine tuning using small data set from the region. But ultimately, like when you have the final goal, then the decision has to be made by an expert or like subject matter expertise, right? So when we have that result, like what we do is like we try to bring in additional supplemental data set, which enables us to really verify that what we are getting out of model is landslide related, right? So we have landslide susceptibility maps, which are generated way advanced. There are global, there are like country specific maps as well, and there are land cover maps. Like the landslide generally happens over certain land cover, or like we can use slope thresholds to look at like removing false positive, right? So these are like the expert judgment that we bring in at the end before releasing the data to make sure or like validate to a certain extent that whatever we are putting out is accurate as much as possible. It's never going to be 100%, but I think at the end, like a human expert or judgment is necessary for us to gain trust, or like able for me to say like, hey, you can use this data to a certain extent with disclaimers, I'd say.
I just want to jump in on validation here too. I mean, I've already said this a bunch, but like people looking at your map who live there and telling you what they think of it, that's my favorite data set, bar none. If you can't do that, my second favorite thing to do, also generated by people, is news media, journalists. What we've been doing a lot of at Floodbase actually is using LLMs to do this sort of convergence of evidence approach of like, where have floods been reported in the media in this place? And does our flood history actually detect not just did a flood happen, but the ranking and severity of that event? And we can combine that with insurance records. We can combine that with the US National Storm Events Database, precipitation records. So I think like you can triangulate, and don't just triangulate with 3 things. You can now do it with 5 or 6 things. And LLMs really can help you do this. We used to buy social media and news flood events from a company called Flood Tags that would do this for you with BERT and other sort of AI models, but you can kind of now do it yourself with LLMs. So that's been a really great tool for us, I think, on data quality. Yeah, journalists are doing a lot of this work for us. And if we can aggregate that and turn it into data, which you now can, use it.
And I guess maybe just one thing I'd add to was getting those local, I mentioned it before, but getting those local partners on the ground is really important. For example, when we think about the populations work that we're doing with the University of Washington, one of the reasons that we decided to take that ambitious project is because they've spent years and years and years working with the Gates Foundation, going door to door in a lot of communities, understanding where people are to determine, how do you develop models to describe the number of people who need a malaria vaccine, right? And kids that need that, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they had this wealth of, I wouldn't say just data, but knowledge on how to even approach the problem of looking at ground truth data in a way that wouldn't be otherwise knowledge on our team. So I think, Rachel, you kind of mentioned the problems that I think everyone's going to hit when they play in this space: data scarcity, just no ground truth data. And every problem that I heard today is a really hard problem that no one's actually solved before. And if you had great ground truth data, then you would be able to solve that problem easily. So I just think, in addition to everything that's said, finding those complementary partners on the ground, that they don't necessarily need to be like a research scientist AI team, but they have a skill and expertise on how to think about the problem, and they actually are present, will actually make a big difference. So.
All right. Well, very insightful from all corners. We are going to open it up to some of the questions that have been rolling in. We've had many, and if you didn't notice, our participation in the event peaked somewhere around 300. I don't know where exactly. we've had a bunch of questions that have been rolling in, and I think one of the key takeaways is already quite evident in everyone's comments is that there's no answer in any subfield of DRM yet about what is the perfect absolute approach to AI application. That there's a whole lot of questions that arise, and there's a whole lot of fine-tuning, supervision, continued contextual articulation work that needs to be done. We have several questions that sort of came up in the early part during specific panelists and a few general ones. I'll turn it over to Rachel to ask one of the first ones here.
Sure. So this also hits the data scarcity question, but it's for Kevin. Um, and I think this is a really interesting question. I don't think that there's one answer, but maybe I'm wrong. Are there white spaces where no satellite imagery of the land or population is available? And if so, what are the solutions that are used, like heterogeneous data types, for example, et cetera? And that's from Megan Richards.
Thanks, Megan, for the question. I would say, yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting at that problem of when you're actually looking at open data, that's publicly available, how can you look at more like consistent real-time satellite imagery throughout the world? We've been fortunate enough to have a collaboration with Planet, and I think a couple of us on this, or probably all of us on the team have worked with Planet because they've got a great capability to take a picture of the Earth every day. It's at a lower resolution, but with AI models, you can still really kind of get a lot of value out of that. But it is a challenge. I think some of the foundational models that are emerging, I think kind of Dan hit on this also with, developing embeddings and being able to, do similarity analysis will help over time in some of those areas. But, it's an area where when there isn't satellite imagery available in certain parts of the world that's open, getting some of these other data sets, statistical data sets, does help, but it's an area I don't have a great answer for. I feel like we're kind of lucky because we've got that collaboration with Planet. One of the things we do is whenever we're working to produce the data sets, we're doing it all as a digital public good. So I think one of the things that are the outputs of our models will actually continue to help put more information out there in the ecosystem that everybody can use. But it's an area where, I think, I continue to have conversations with folks at the UN just saying, hey, wouldn't it be nice if you guys could actually buy this data and open it up? Because there has to be some sort of a give or take for both the commercial companies who are launching the satellites and putting a huge amount of investment cost into getting those up in space. So I guess that's how I would answer it. I don't know if anyone else has anything to build on that, but it's a great question.
And I'd love to open that up to the other panelists here as well. Just in terms of how do you fill in the gaps? I know that's kind of how we touched on it a little bit earlier, but if you have any direct examples, please feel free to share.
See, it's a really hard problem.
Oh yeah, no, it's not like there's going to be a direct answer. It's an impossible question to answer. I'll start there. But I just wanted to open that up to the rest of the panel as well, because I think there's such a diverse set of problems here, and so I'm just intrigued to see what the answers might be.
Just throw a couple options out there too, because we're running short on time. There's a couple of comments and questions in the chat or in the Q&A about the recent Pakistan floods and how we might go about applying some of these tools to cases like that. Beth, that's obviously one you might be best positioned to comment on. I brought up earlier, Kevin, the work with post-disaster damage assessment in Myanmar that Microsoft assisted with, but that type of rapid response work, I think we all do in different ways of recognition. And another thing that's in the chat here that I wanted to point out, which we can talk about in depth in later webinars as well, is questions of governance. So any thoughts that you have? I mean, Beth, we had a really fascinating example of the challenge when working in spaces with complex questions of governance and conflict. But any specific comments on data governance as well, and the ways that you approach governance questions in specific projects that you do. Those are just a couple of prompts, and anyone can jump in on these. We've got a few more minutes.
I guess, Austin, on the disaster response that you kind of had mentioned, when we see these extreme events happen, for example, with Pakistan, that we're seeing with flooding, and we saw it actually last year or 2 years ago when they had some really horrible floods too. One of the things that we've worked on, and happy to follow up offline with folks who need the links, just send me a LinkedIn message, is we built a building damage assessment model that we can run on imagery after there's a extreme event. And then what it does is it gives you the ability to quickly, going back to the old school AI is still cool, even though everyone knows ChatGPT, but old school AI still is actually cool. You can just label a couple of models or a couple of damaged buildings, and then just do a quick fine-tune retrain, and then it will just pop you out over the AOI kind of a set of areas where there's likely damage. And so I think, to kind of close the loop, we're talking about risk, but extreme events are going to happen, and that is another application of AI. We did it with the Myanmar earthquake. Every time we do this and we respond, and our team will do them for big events like the Myanmar earthquake, we will put them out on OCHA or Esri for anyone to download. So, over.
Awesome. And if there's any other questions from answers from the panelists now, otherwise I can prompt to one final question for all the panelists. It's much more broad and sweeping. Basically, if you could highlight an issue or problem area, what are your kind of final and future thoughts on the use of AI in the disaster space? Where do you think, you see like the writing on the wall, even 6 months from now, with understanding the application of AI in the disaster space? It could be related to your, specific hazard of interest, or your application of interest, but just broadly speaking, what do you think the conversations are going to be moving forward?
Yeah, so for me, I guess we have gotten very good at looking at individual disaster quantification using AI and ML, right? With recent initiative like early warning for all, I think is equally important for all groups to come together, start thinking about quantifying cascading hazard and its impact using machine learning. Recently, there has been like multiple cascading events, particularly in South Asia. It might sound like a dream, but might be worth trying, leveraging expertise and knowledge that is gained by all of us looking at this hazard individually. So I think that might be a worthwhile effort going forward in the future.
For me, the litmus test about whether or not this is working is right now, Maxar, which is a commercial data provider, provides open data for disasters. Not very many disasters, but like, I don't know, 5, 6 per year. And when this starts to work, especially with these cloud native formats to be able to view and browse those data sets like pretty immediately, plus the ability to embed these images with sort of the semantics, those two things combined, if it's working, then what that means is that like as within 30 minutes of that image being the post-disaster image being released alongside with the pre-disaster images, which is sort of what they do, the idea of having many people measuring, finding things just like they would engage with Google Maps, but things that happen through time, direct measurement, and logging those measurements in an open way. And so it's not about like, a better model here. The idea is to be able to start to use those co-pilot-like tools in order to be able to report out in a very open, distributed way based off of data that is already streaming down and has been for like 6 or 7 years.
I would say I am more interested in how AI is being used to address like systemic risk and vulnerability than just response in the moment. I'm a little bit skeptical of how transformational it will be to, like, I think what Dan is saying is very cool, but if that's really going to be used and leveraged to save lives effectively in a response context, I mean, maybe, but you've got to lay the groundwork of like, what is the information and decision-making flow of that response organization? How are they going to take that data and validate it and like know how that's going to be used in their process beforehand? Because I think it's really hard to do in the moment. And so I think like, yes, those tools are interesting and could be transformational, but if and only if the sort of groundwork is laid, I think, from the social and decision-making perspective. And I'm also really interested in, things like insurance or how flood maps are made, because I think our real opportunity is not to just use AI in the moment of the crisis. It's to use AI to like make insurance exist where it did not exist before so that a government who has data can actually respond to the disaster. Like I got into insurance because we were making flood maps for the Republic of Congo, and they were like, great, I'm so glad we have a new flood map. With what money do you expect me to go do anything about this? And like, I was like, oh my gosh, if we haven't solved disaster risk financing, who cares if we mapped all the buildings that flooded perfectly? And so, like, thinking more broadly about beyond just let's use AI for where did the disaster happen today to thinking about how do we use that to actually develop products to solve the problem is much more exciting to me. And I'm going to plug another academic paper, my student who wrote about disaster recovery, because I think it's really underutilized kind of in the sort of long-term disaster recovery sense. And we just kind of hyper focus on the moment itself. And I want us to think more about before and after the disaster happens.
And I'll just kind of, I guess, I'll just close with, I think, echoing a little bit of kind of the foundational model aspect. I just think that as we start developing more foundational models and being able to use those embeddings to understand just how the laws of physics are working in a lot of these different areas, whether it's response, understanding weather, I do think there's going to be a whole new set of insights or capabilities. Like I think what Dan is showing us that his tool is building is a great example of that. I completely agree that it's not really clear where it's going to land and how fast it's going to get there. But I do think when we have those foundational models of the Earth, and I've seen them starting in weather. I know with Aurora on our side, we've got a great model that's really producing amazing results. But even just the basic imagery and being able to find the similarity analysis is going to, I think it's going to change the conversation. And I think it's going to change the conversation in ways that is going to like lead to exactly what Beth is saying, which is like, okay, if we have this information, what do we do about it? And how do we change process flows? And can we be more prepared in financing? Can it be available in lots of different areas of the globe that actually is showing, real ground truth and helping those risk operators or those insurance companies or the regulators kind of move forward. So I'm excited to see the innovation in the foundational model sense, and then be able to collaborate with lots of people on, well, what do we do about that? So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And thank you again to our speakers. As we've been reminded by recent events, right, both domestically and globally, stakes of this conversation are so real. Disasters aren't like this distant or infrequent thing. And I think for a lot of our panelists here, that's very well understood. They're very much a part of our shared present. And the balance of innovation and responsibility is really exemplified by the individuals we've seen today and is exactly why these conversations matter. And so I'm going to hand it off to Austin.
I'll end it really quickly just because we are over time. I'm, like Rachel, extremely grateful for all of you being able to join and share your insights and your analysis and your energy, frankly. This is an incredibly dynamic space, and it's exciting to have the level the level of accomplishment and energy we have in this room. I'm really excited about a lot of the questions that came up on access, on pluralizing user base, on transformation, on how we get around chronic questions on how we kind of get around how we wrangle with chronic questions of data scarcity and the blank spaces, and recognizing that we need a lot of different types of input from a lot of different types of people, which means broadening our understanding of what expertise is. and who's an expert, right? Community engagement came up many times. This is something we've tried to highlight in all of our webinars, even those that are very, very tech forward, so to speak. And it's really refreshing to hear that we come back there in the end, right? That full spectrum engagement with different stakeholders is critical for any sort of purposeful application of disaster tech. With that, I will truly shut it down. Thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone who who gave excellent questions throughout the webinar. This was really a pleasure. We look forward to continuing the conversation. As we said, hopefully a couple more webinars on different aspects of this topic, following on some of the questions that came up. And thank you to the folks who support the work of our program at the Stimson Center. Again, one more time, the Government of Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, and the McConnell Foundation for their support, the general work we do, which enables this series. This was excellent, and yeah, couldn't be happier with how this conversation played out. Thanks a lot, everyone, and take care.